Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertierra, and today we're going to be talking about Russia. Specifically, we're going to be talking about a revolution which served as a precursor to the 1917 revolutions in Russia, which would change the course not only of Russian history, but also world history, as it would create the USSR and thus shape the run-up to World War II and then a subsequent Cold War. We are fast approaching the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, so a discussion of the revolution which preceded it, and often gets far less attention, seemed like a good choice. We hope you enjoyed today's show, and if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to post them in the thread in the main sub. If you enjoy the show, feel free to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/AskHistorians. So with that, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertierra, and today we'll be talking with Doug Priest, also known as 10-Minute History on the sub. Today we'll be talking about the Russian Revolution of 1905, the lesser-known predecessor to the Russian revolutions of 1917. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. So before we start, I just wanted to ask, what made you interested in history to begin with, both in general and in Russia in particular?
Sure. So I went to college as a freshman, actually as a computer science major. I started as a computer science major, but I had done well enough on my AP exams in computer science in high school that I didn't actually have to take any computer science classes my first year, and I had just general education courses. So I had this first semester history class. It was just like literally History 101, and it was the ancient world or some kind of ridiculous title like that, as if you could do that in one class. But I had this amazing professor by the name of Terry Gore. This was at the State University of New York at Brockport, and he's since passed away, unfortunately, but he made history really, really interesting to me for the first time, and the way he taught it, the excitement that he brought to class. And so I signed up for another course with him my second semester, and sort of by the end of that second semester, I had decided, I really want to do history, and I decided I was going to double major. I was going to keep my computer science major, and I was going to do a history major because I just thought it was fascinating. And then about another year later, I decided to just go with history, and I dropped the computer science major. It just wasn't really for me, it turned out, and so I just went full on for history. It was about that time that I also started to learn about Russia and the Soviet Union. I took a course my sophomore year, the second semester of my sophomore year, and that was just a general survey on the Soviet Union with a professor named Meredith Roman, also at SUNY Brockport. And that was a course that I took because I was interested in revolutions and radical politics, and I just thought I really need to learn about all this, how it happened in practice and all of that. And she was a great professor, made the course very interesting, and I ended up working with her in some independent studies after that, and also she was my advisor when I did my master's at that same university. So I guess my story is very professor-based. I think good teachers can really make a topic fascinating for you, and I just took that and ran with it.
Definitely. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the role of professors in getting people inspired to really research history and not fall into the trap of thinking it's just a bunch of dates and kings' names.
Yeah, exactly. Both of those professors that I mentioned did just a really good job of, making it a topic that's about human experience. And that's the kind of thing that makes history really interesting to me, is what people are experiencing and what motivates them and all of those kinds of things.
Exactly. Great. So now we're going to jump into the to Russia for a second. Before we start getting into the 1905 revolution proper, let's just set the scene a little bit. First, Russia is at this time one of the few remaining at least in historiography, is often referred to as an absolutist monarchy. What kind of monarchy are we looking at in Russia during this period?
Right, so as late as 1917, obviously, but certainly still at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia is an absolute monarchy. It's run by the Tzar. In this case, it's Nicholas II, and his power is essentially unchecked. In England and continental Europe, we've seen the transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy over the last century or so before that, in some cases even a little bit longer than that. But in Russia, most of those reforms have not come by the 20th century. There is a undercurrent of socialism, of radical politics, of reform-minded intellectuals, liberals in Russia that is really starting to take off, especially after 1870 or so. But those reforms are politically non-existent. So the government is essentially run entirely by the Tsar and those appointed by the Tsar still.
Interesting. And what's the relationship, for example, between the Tsar and the economy? Because you're seeing a lot of the expansion of the role of the state elsewhere in Europe. The state in this case is still kind of the Tsar. They're kind of the same, not entirely the same thing, but there's a lot of overlap. Is there also does the Russian state also have a huge role in the Russian economy during this period?
The Russian state is at this point in time, really running the bulk of the economy in the sense that it all happens at the behest of the Tsar. But he is not centrally planning the economy in the way that some states are starting to take a more expanded role, as you just mentioned. We actually see quite a bit of foreign influence in the economy in Russia at this time, especially because the Russian economy is still, by the 20th century, extremely agrarian, and the industrialization that's happening is a lot of times happening because of the fact that foreign investors are coming in and starting to put money into factories and start those kinds of things. So there's an enormous amount of money coming in from the outside, and ultimately the Tsar is in control of what exactly can be done, but we're starting to see some tension between the traditionally agrarian economy and this increasing amount of industrialization that is still, by European standards, relatively minor, but greatly expanding in Russia around the turn of the century.
And that kind of segues into the next question, which would be, what I've read about the 19th century in Russia tends to paint it as a period of reforms. Obviously, there's a lot of advance and then, return and kind of like pushback and reaction. But what are the kinds of like major reforms that were happening or people were trying to implement in 19th century Russia that we should keep in mind for the 1905 revolution?
Sure. So in the 19th century, of course, the biggest thing that you'll hear about is the freeing of the serfs in 1861. And this reform is comparable to really ending a kind of slavery in the Russian economy. Serfs in the Russian paradigm were entirely tied to the land, entirely living at the behest of the landowners. And so there was, in the early to mid 19th century, quite a bit of pushback against this. And you had started to see a populist movement, even among intellectuals, to free the serfs. You see some of this even in like Tolstoy's writing. You can see it in Russian fiction. These kinds of topics are on the mind of people who are writing in the 19th century in Russia, Turgenev and so forth. And I think that question, the agrarian question, the question about what to do with the serfs and the peasantry, dominated the reform-minded intellectual class of the second half of the 19th century in particular. And I think the important thing to add here is the intellectual class in Russia was really concerned about its connection to the peasantry in general, vis-a-vis Russianness. The peasantry somehow captured in the minds of intellectuals a certain kind of natural Russianness. Of course, this is a problematic way of thinking about it, but this is how they were thinking about it. And therefore, the relationship between the Russian reforms and the peasantry had this very strong kind of like nationalist, ethnic quality to it.
Interesting. And so, in terms of the serfs, what are the kind of like the consequences for this process of industrialization that these serfs get kind of liberated?
Right. So, after 1961, you see a period in which, as a matter of legality, the serfs are freed. And yet, in practice, what happens is most of them stay where they are, of course, because that's where they live and that's where their families are from, and that's what they know how to do. And so they're now, instead of just entirely tied to the land, they're being paid, and there's a kind of shift in the agrarian landscape that is not incredibly dissimilar to the end of slavery in the United States, aside from the fact that these were not chattel slaves. This is a major difference. But in terms of the process of transitioning, you have labor that is now essentially free. And you start to see some peasants, even by 1905, still like 80% of the country is living in the countryside. But some peasants are starting to move more towards urban centers, either permanently or as migrant workers, to participate in the industrial economy that's starting to build up. This is more towards the end of the 19th century now. But the issue is, of course, that in spite of the fact that you have some economic reforms and some reforms that are, quite obviously really important for the people who are no longer living at the behest of landowners, that doesn't mean that the economy is, transformed overnight. And so it's still a fairly slow process from 1861 to the beginning of the 20th century, where the economy itself is still very, very agrarian based. The average peasant, I'll use the term peasant rather than serf after 1861, is still in pretty bad shape. It's not like they get freed and suddenly their lives are amazing. In fact, they're still, working very hard for very little. And they're still essentially tied to the land as just a matter of their de facto economic life, even though they're legally no longer tied to the land or to a particular person. And as a result, the shift takes a long time to happen, really, 40 or 50 years.
It's actually reminding me, you mentioned the U.S. South post-slavery, but it's also reminding me actually of the British colonies in the Caribbean, which liberated the slaves in the 1830s, and the same people who owned all the land continued to own all the land. The freed slaves did not get any money to buy their own land or to leave. They didn't get any training. They didn't get anything. So they were legally freed, but they were not really given any means to really change the face of how the economy had largely worked up until then. So it's interesting that, obviously, major difference. They were chattel slaves. This is significantly different than even serfs, but still, it's interesting that these are dates that in history books are often very emphasized. This is the date that the serfs were free. This is the date that the slaves were free, but the major transformations couldn't happen immediately because the people who were not freed were not given really much means to actually better their situation.
Right, and this remains an important issue all the way up into the 20th century, which is that people who want reform and are, I talked about this sort of affinity for the peasantry, are talking a lot about how do we solve exactly that problem, precisely that problem, because the peasantry is still, as you say, essentially tied to the land. They're tied to where they were, and there were a number of different solutions floated for exactly how that might be rectified. It could be something like just cash, giving them money so that they can sort of move, so that they have the opportunity to, actually build something of a life. And then there's also, more radical politics that suggests that there should be a more significant redistribution of land and so forth.
And that actually segues perfectly into the next point, which is the penetration of liberal and socialist thought into Russia during this period. Because, of course, liberalism and socialism, while they, in the 19th century, may have both been, let's say, birthed by different kind of Enlightenment traditions, they were very different ideologies, and they both are really, as I think you mentioned, they start to penetrate into Russia around the 1870s in a significant way.
Yes, I think starting in the 1870s especially is when you start to see a uprising of what I would call, first of all, populist ideology among intellectuals, and that comes partly from what I was talking about earlier, and partly from a desire to see a more democratic form of government. And so this is not so much coming from the peasantry itself, for a variety of reasons. The peasantry is still a relatively conservative force throughout the 19th century in Russia. There are peasant uprisings here and there, but not substantial countrywide kinds of protests or anything like that. And so this is an undercurrent that's coming from educated people. Obviously, education in Russia in the second half of the 19th century is still quite limited. The literacy rate is quite low, and the ability for these kinds of ideas to make their way into the countryside is pretty limited still. So you see this coming from people who are well educated. They're as well educated as people who are living in continental Europe, who are getting education in major cities like Paris or London or anything like that. And in fact, many Russian intellectuals are educated themselves in those places, so they're familiar with those communities. And some of that direct connection also helps to establish the coming of a more liberal and then socialist set of ideas.
I think I've heard mentioned that Freud, Lenin, Trotsky, and I think one or two other major figures from the period were all coincided in Vienna at one point.
Right, and Vienna towards the turn of the 20th century, second half of the 19th century, is kind of a capital of cosmopolitanism. And there's it's a hotbed of intellectual ideas, of intellectual development, of I won't say just radical politics, but also of liberalization, and there's a bunch of really influential thinkers who are there from a lot of different places. And I think the fact that they're from a lot of different places actually matters too, because it encourages a kind of robustness of thought that is applicable to a variety of different places that isn't happening just in Vienna by any means during this time period, but it is definitely known as a particularly important place for this kind of intellectual exchange.
Interesting. And so this is this very cosmopolitan world is the backdrop, the kind of intellectual backdrop for the penetration of these ideas into a Russia that is still very much traditionalist and all the rest. What as the Russia moves forward and you start getting to see these both in the West, all these alliances between all these different countries in the lead up to World War I, in the east, you also have the expansion of Russia, and one of the catalysts for the 1905 revolution, which is the Russo-Japanese War. Could you talk a little bit about that?
This is a particularly important moment for the development of the 1905 revolution that we've only just begun to talk about, I suppose, because the Russian Empire understood itself to be a major, military and, for that matter, political player in the world, and it was. But in 1904, we have the Russian Empire and the Japanese going to war, and this is a pretty big problem for Russia, it turns out, because it was pitched not as a big deal. It was the consequences of this war are I think what we should focus on here, rather than the details of the actual event, which are not especially important for 1905, but the consequences are this, which is you have a military who feels like it has been betrayed by the leadership for making some pretty bad decisions with regards to this war, that's not as confident about its leadership up to and including the Tzar. Now, the military doesn't fully revolt during this time period, but it is a big blow. You'll also hear people talk about the sort of the psychological ramifications, which is that it's a real blow to Russia to have been defeated by lowly Japan during this 1905, it's over by the fall of 1905 war. And so I think it forces a lot of people throughout the country, intellectuals, people in the military, even peasants start to hear about this. It's a big change in the way Russians are thinking about their place in the world at a time when there are a number of other factors that are contributing to a pretty widespread instability, and maybe we can talk about some of those as well. But the war itself, it stretches the economy. It's causing this social unrest because of the loss, and it's also basically makes Russia the first European state. And this is going to sound terrible, but this is how they understood it at the time, to be essentially humiliated by an Asian country, and that bothered them. And it sounds like racist to talk about it now, because obviously they were in fact racist. And I just want to be clear that I'm talking about what they thought about this, but that was a major factor in how Russia was perceived in the, cosmology of European political power and empire.
And what were the other issues that you mentioned in passing that were contributing to this instability?
First of all, we have a nobility that has been increasingly impoverished after the freeing of the serfs. So nobility here, important to make sure everyone who's listening is clear on, is a social class, not necessarily an economic class. So when we talk about impoverished nobility, that makes sense. You can be of this social lineage, but beyond that, be in hard times. And so you have this class, which is a major base of support for the Tsar and for the Russian Empire in general, who is starting to really feel economically disadvantaged through the economic reforms that have happened towards the end of the 20th century. And so there's a loss of confidence there a little bit. Again, they still support the Tsar. There's still a lot of factors that keep them supporting the monarchy, not least of which is Russian Orthodoxy. It has a very strong religious element. But so that's one bit of instability. You have the increasing intellectual embracing of reform or radical ideas, which we talked about already. We have a stretching and a little bit of... so we have a difficulty of embracing and incorporating many different ethnicities in the Russian Empire into this new economy, into this new social structure that's kind of emerging. And so there's this nationality question. Obviously, we have the army that we just talked about, which is feeling a little bit betrayed and humiliated. And then we have this emerging working class, which is a relatively minor player in terms of the numbers of people involved, but the industrial economy that does exist in Russia around the turn of the century is increasingly important in terms of its economic and strategic role in the country, for all the reasons that the industrial economy is important in other places as well. And the working class, the blue-collar workers who are working in those factories, are starting to realize that that gives them some leverage, because they are an important factor in making that strategic power actually work. So there's a whole number of things, none of which by themselves is probably enough to cause the kind of upheaval that we see in 1905, but when put together, create this social fabric that is really vulnerable to unrest.
Interesting. So it's kind of the cracking of the of not just the economy that had sustained Tsarist Russia, but also kind of the social fabric that was implicitly connected to that. Yeah, interesting. So now we've appropriately set up the 1905 revolution. What is it that kind of just sparks this and starts this blaze?
So it is, first of all, a demonstration. And this is January of 1905. There's a workers' dispute. And they want the Tzar to intervene on their behalf and kind of force the owners of the factories where they work to sort of meet their demands and all of that kind of stuff. And they are marching, and they are led, in fact, by a member of the clergy. So this is not a radical protest. This is not a protest that's coming out with socialist leaders. By 1905, the Bolsheviks exist already. The RSDLP, from which they came, is, a notable political party, but this isn't what's happening here. This isn't led by socialists. This is a relatively moderate group of people, certainly reform-minded, but not radical. And so they're marching for this reason, and on January 9th, 1905, the protest is fired upon and essentially massacred, and this is known as Bloody Sunday. And this really set fire to Russia for months. When the news of this happened, when the news that this happened kind of spread throughout the country, there were demonstrations in every city, small cities, big cities. You even start to see a little bit of uprising in the countryside. And so just a couple of years prior, for example, there were, low grain prices, and so there had been a few minor peasant uprisings in 1901 to 1903. So there had been some note that this could happen, but suddenly this event, in which not just workers but members of the clergy are kind of fired upon and many are killed, sparks a major period of social unrest throughout the Russian Empire.
It sounds like they didn't really have a mechanism to really deal with this kind of pushback without resorting to violence and therefore escalating it.
Right. And so right after this happens, the demonstrations were pretty massive, and what press there was starts to be pretty critical of the authority. And so you've got to see Nicholas decides, okay, I'm gonna take a moment here. He tries to calm people down. He says, I'm gonna set up an inquiry into why this happened, how exactly this happened. Not the event itself, but all of the reasons for the discontent that was going on. And so this is now amidst the Russo-Japanese War that we're talking about. It's still going on.
When did the Russo-Japanese War end, approximately?
So it's not until the fall of that year that we see the Treaty of Portsmouth that actually puts the end to that war, which was not, the ending was not as bad for Russia as it could have been, but the full context of what was happening end up contributing throughout the year to all of the unrest that's going on. So the fact that this happens in January and then in February we start to see the Russians losing some battles contributes to the moment.
Got it. So this protest and massacre occurs in January, and the war is still going on, and it's still going to be going on until the fall of 1905.
That's right. And so you've got a whole bunch of different agendas here. You've got the people who want to preserve the monarchy, who want to preserve absolute monarchy. You've got reformers who want something closer to constitutional monarchy. They don't want to overthrow the Tzar. They just want to establish the kind of constitutional government that exists elsewhere in Europe and England and so forth. And then you've got more radical socialists who are pushing for a complete overhaul of the system of government and the economy. And you've also got, in fact, by the summer of 1905, a considerable amount of unrest even among the peasantry. So you've got people living out in the countryside who are not, they're not demonstrating against the Tsar the way people are in the major cities, but they're starting to, take economic action that is against their landlords, because now, remind you, they're not tied to the land, but most of them are still renting their land. So they are starting to sort of get in on this atmosphere of unrest, and they're not necessarily all politically thinking about whether or not they side with the liberal reformers or the radical socialists or anything like that, but they do know that the same kinds of people who are being protested against are screwing them over too. And so you start to see considerable unrest throughout the countryside as well. And this happens over the course of just a few months.
And so you've got this protest, this pushback against the policies of the Tsar's government and all these economic injustices and all this happening during over a period of several months. And so what is this build to? What does the Russian government do?
So eventually what we see is in September of 1905, a Soviet of Workers' Deputies is established in St. Petersburg. This is, again, 1905, not 1917. Soviet in the Russian is just a word for like a council, so it doesn't necessarily have a inherently communist meaning. Obviously, by now it has that tinge, but these workers' councils were a way of organizing for workers politically. And they are elected by like local factory workers and so forth, and they say, here's what we want. We want a constitutional monarchy. We want to be able to set some standards for the power of the Tsar, limits to his power, and the unrest that has built throughout the whole country from all these different directions really plays into the fact that the Tsar doesn't think that he can put this down the same way that he put down the protests in January. And it gets to that point where he's worried that if he puts this down violently, the backlash could be so harsh that it could end his reign. And so he issues what is known now as the October Manifesto, and that is essentially the establishing of a assembly, a parliament that's going to be elected. It establishes some very basic civil liberties or civil rights that the Tsar shouldn't be able to overrule, and these kinds of things. And he does this as a way to calm the situation down and to maybe institute some of the reforms that people are talking about. And after about 10 months of this kind of unrest in the country, this is a very welcome moment for many people. This is kind of what many people have been waiting for, and it seems like they're getting what they want. But there's one really critical provision here that we see established right from the beginning, and it is that although they're going to establish this Duma, the parliament, and they're going to be elected by essentially adult males, women are still mostly left out, the Tsar himself still has the ability from the beginning here to dissolve the Duma at his discretion and call for new elections. So this is a way that he thinks he can still exert some power over the legislative process and over this parliament, and it proves to be probably the most important part of what comes out of 1905. So this is a moment where a constitutional monarchy is essentially being hashed out, but where the absolute monarch is still, in ways that he hasn't in some of the other countries where this has been established, really keeping the reins in the direction of the government.
I think it was Marx who made a jape about the monarchy in England or the UK, and he said something to the effect of their only responsibility is to have kids. And while obviously in this case the Tsar would he wouldn't be a figurehead, he'd still basically be the executive branch of the government.
That's right, and it's absolutely not a figurehead as the next 12 years would prove. But they do go ahead with electing a Duma, and that whole process does begin to start in earnest. And in 1905, in October, when this manifesto comes down, it's actually it's enough to sort of quell that revolutionary moment, right? With the part where it seemed like it's all falling apart, and Nicholas makes this proclamation as a way to calm it down. It actually works. The people who are the most radical are not necessarily buying into this, but most of the people aren't the radicals. And so to the reformers, this seems like a major concession they've won.
Definitely. So it's the Duma at this point, right? They formed the Duma, right? Which is like the Russian equivalent of like a parliament. So they've created this Duma. It's a kind of compromise situation. Things seem to be going well, right?
Right. And so the elections are held, and the Duma meets for the first time in April of 1906. Okay, and so the largest group of elected officials here, so we're talking people from the whole country represented, urban, rural, there's a fair bit of representation, and the wild card here is the peasantry. because the peasantry is traditionally not a especially politically mobilized group in Russia. We talked about how in 1905 there had been some revolts that coincided with the political uprisings that happened in the cities, and there had been some revolts a little bit earlier because of low grain prices and the economic factors, but they were not, members of socialist workers' parties. They were not identifying with working class people, and there was not a concern on the part of the Tsar that the peasantry was going to be a really progressive force within the Duma. In fact, the expectation was that the peasantry would be a rather conservative force in the Duma. But it turns out that this was really not the case, because this is the people, these are coming from the people who are, as we talked about, concerned about land. They're still not really landowners. They're still renting. And one of the major things that comes out of the peasantry is a demand to transfer land to the peasantry, essentially from these landowners, from the nobility, from the gentry. And so the first major act, essentially, of the Duma is coming out of the peasantry and demanding land reform. And this is very unexpected from Nicholas. He did not see this coming.
And so you've got this this peasantry, which is, these are completely understandable demands, I guess, in hindsight, but I guess it caught him off guard.
Right, it did. And he reacts by exercising that power that I just explained a few minutes earlier, and he decides this is unacceptable. He dissolves the Duma. He dissolves the first Duma, and he calls for a new election. So this is now right after the first meeting of the first Duma. We have this constitutional monarchy that's kind of in the process of being created, and right out of the gates we're seeing absolutism rear its head again. And that doesn't mean that the Duma is dissolved completely, obviously. It just means that they're going to have new elections. He's hoping that he can get a more friendly Duma elected to his idea of how this country should be run, which is still much more conservative and traditional than this first Duma imagined. And so it takes about another year for the process to complete itself. The original Duma is dissolved, new elections are called for, they have the elections, the new Duma meets, and now it's 1907, and it's March, and the second Duma meets, and this one turns out to be even more radical than the first, in part because of the fact that he had dissolved the first one. So people were upset about that. The calls for land reform were not seen as completely radical by most people. And so now you've got, a year later, an even more radical assembly put into place. And now Nicholas is facing a much more hostile group than the first one.
It honestly reminds me a bit of Hannah Arendt's book on revolution. It's less well known compared to her book on the origins of totalitarianism. But in her book on revolution, she has this one part on where she talks about the French Revolution, and she says that part of the problem there was that when everything was barely held together by tradition and immobility, and things were the way they are because the way they are, just tautologies like that, the moment the concessions began to be given, then it starts to be a question of, well, why not this as well? Well, why not that? Well, why not that? And so concessions seem to just be an easy, slippery slope to radical reforms and revolution in this case.
Right. And so as this 1907 assembly, the second Duma, starts to go to work, Nicholas realizes that this too is going to be a problem for him. And he turns to a figure people might be familiar with, Pyotr Stolypin, who is... Stolypin is like just like the Minister of Internal Affairs, I think, and he is going to rewrite at Nicholas's behest the rules for electing the Duma, because he's gone over two as far as he's concerned, and they need to, from the Tsar's perspective, work with an assembly that's going to be not so hostile to him. Now, obviously, this is not a particularly democratic spirit, but that's what he does. So Stolypin decides to rewrite this to produce a third Duma, and this one is going to favor the gentry, essentially, instead of the peasantry when it comes to the electoral rules, so that people who are a little more part of the upper crust of the Russian social fabric will be disproportionately empowered by the electoral rules, and hopefully, Nicholas thinks, this is going to solve the problem.
And I take it doesn't.
Well, it does and it doesn't. They do elect a third Duma. We see essentially a run back of exactly what happened the first time, in which, in relatively short order, the second Duma is dissolved, and the third Duma is elected using the rules established by Stolypin, and it more or less comes to a place of relative stability, I would say. It is not a radical Duma by any stretch, and it is a group that essentially is willing to play ball with the Tsar. And so we have, by this time, a Duma that is going to exist in a kind of, minimally reformist fashion that is not going to, call for major land reform the way the peasants wanted to, and it's not going to call for a major political or economic reform the way the second Duma wanted to. But it does some things with regards to the freedom of the press and these things that are just enough to sort of stabilize the situation.
And then, so that's kind of how the 1905 revolution would end, or would you say that there are like kind of ripples afterwards, or that's kind of the...
Yeah, so there's a few things that are important that come out of this. I'm of the school of thought that likes to think of, the Russian revolutions of the early 20th century as quite connected. I don't think talking just about like 1905 by itself or 1917 by itself gives enough context. And in the history of 20th century Russia, the importance here is that we do see a popular uprising that was enough to create a at least minimally effective constitutional monarchy, still, mind you, quite absolute by comparison, but there's a little bit of a give there, and that the imperial government, realizes that it needs to work with this Duma. So that's part of the reason why they try to get more people in there who are willing to work with them instead of overthrow them or demand some radical changes that they're just not willing to concede. But they do make other concessions, like they're willing to work with Alexander Guchkov, the so-called Octobrist party, rather. And these were like the reformers. These are the people who really thought the original October Manifesto back in 1905 had the right kinds of things in it. So these were not the more radical socialists who believed in a more substantial revolution politically and economically. But he's willing to work with the slightly more liberal reformers who make some concessions to get some more support through. And so Guchkov is not a liberal in the modern sense of the word, but by comparison, He's for a little bit more in the way of civil rights and stuff like that. But he's still a monarchist, right? He's still someone who supports the monarchy. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about, right? Not everybody who wants the October Manifesto is for the overthrow of the monarchy. And I want to emphasize here at the end that there's still a pretty rich diversity in the political thought in Russia going forward from 1905. There's many people who think the monarchy can be reformed, who think the position of the Tzar is critically important in Russian life. And it's not just people who are interested left over in revolution. And we leave 1905 with, again, some of these cracks in the monarchy that you talked about, and the reforms have begun, and they've reached a relative position of stability, but it's not a moment that is in crisis anymore. So they've established political parties as legal. They've established more freedom in the press. They've established the ability of people to vote. All of these are really critically important, but they have not fundamentally undermined the power of the Tsar. And so those are the reforms that come out of 1905 in a way that is not really quite satisfactory to anyone involved, but enough concessions are made essentially from all sides to return to a bit of stability, at least for 12 years.
So I think this is also, I'm going to remind listeners, this is also something that people have written books and books and books about. So this is a very condensed version of the 1905 revolution. But I think that it's an important waypoint for those who are interested in especially in the 1917 revolution and what came after it, which is especially pertinent as we're approaching now the 100-year anniversary of the October Revolution later this year. So I have two final questions, and they're a bit more general and historiographical. First, in your mind, what are some of the remaining challenges to how the 1905 revolution is talked about, either academically or in popular terms?
Yeah. So I think I'll start academically and then I'll go popular. Academically, there is definitely a trend right now towards understanding the revolution as an extended period. And insofar as we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, that has largely taken the form of a Russian Revolution that is not defined by 1917, but that is perhaps defined by the onset of World War I all the way through the end of the Russian Civil War. So a period of really about 8 years. And I think trying to rethink the Russian Revolution over this longer time frame is going to be really critically important. The events of 1917 are obviously very important in that narrative, in that story, but understanding it in the bigger picture is important. And I think that goes back to 1905, because that's the beginning of the serious political changes that ultimately are part and parcel to the kind of unrest that happens in 1917. So I don't think you can talk really about the Russian Revolution without contending with 1905, and that's not a new kind of idea. Anybody who takes a survey course on the history of the Soviet Union is going to have a lecture on 1905 to sort of underlay the discussion of politics in the country. But historiographically, I think that needs to become less of a first chapter or an introduction kind of topic and integrated more thoroughly into the discussion of the revolution, broadly speaking, because a lot of the players are already established here. And I mentioned just very, very briefly earlier in the discussion that by 1903, you already have the Bolsheviks as a established political faction, a relatively minor one, but they are taking part themselves in what's going on in 1905 in a way that's not critical or like the most influential, but is related to what eventually happens in 1917. So I think extending out our conception of what it means to think about revolutions not as these critical moments, but as these periods of change, of intense change, is something that I think is being done. It's starting to be done. There was a forum in, I think it was Critica last year, and about the upcoming 100th anniversary of October, and that was a persistent theme from scholars that we need to consider 1917 as 1 year of events in a longer story, and that if we don't tell that whole story, we're really missing so much of what was going on.
That makes perfect sense. The same thing it's another world, it's a whole world away, but same thing happens with Cuba with the 1930s revolution, where most of the key players are already announced. The basic platform of 1959 is already announced. All of even the figure of the dictator who was overthrown in the 1950s gets onto the stage first in the 1930s revolution, but it's not really talked about and integrated into a discussion of the 1950s revolution. So it's interesting that also happens in the case of Russia.
Yeah, and I think that is going on academically right now, and you asked about the popular conception as well, and I think 1905 is mostly forgotten popularly. Obviously 1917 is really explosive, and a lot happens in a relatively short amount of time. It makes for an exciting narrative. It makes it easy to talk about. But a lot of what we talked about today is very similar to the kinds of things that happened in 1917 in terms of the protests that start the whole thing off, in terms of the concessions that are kind of made in the shorter term. Obviously, that ends in the dissolution of the monarchy rather than in some half-baked reforms, but we start to see kind of similar things. So I think the 1905 revolution could be told in a way that is exciting to people, and I hope is brought more thoroughly into the public discussion on the early 20th century in the Soviet Union, in Russia before the Soviet Union, and in the creation of the Soviet Union, because both are pretty critically important. And it was not obvious by any means in 1905 that it was going to lead to 1917. It's only in hindsight that we can make those connections so clearly, but nonetheless, those are things that I hope are becoming more apparent.
Definitely. And finally, what are some of the progresses or great advances in historiography around this period in the last few decades?
So there's a lot of things. I think if we go back a few decades, then we start to see a focus on the revolutions of the early 20th century in Russia that are not just focused on the political uprisings, but on the economic factors, the social factors, which I talked about earlier. I think that ability to contend with a very disrupted social fabric across the spectrum has come out of the last, I would say, 25 years as a way of really contending with all of those different aspects, reaching back into the 19th century in Russia and into the early 20th century. So I think starting to see things as a broad set of circumstances rather than just focusing on the political or just on the economic, those kinds of things are an important advancement that's come, and it's a lot of it has happened, especially with regards to what happened in the revolutions of 1917, came because in the early 90s the Russian archives became open to foreigners really for the first time in any substantial way. And so a lot of the documents that had been housed in Russian archives for 100 years essentially became open to scholars from the United States, from Europe, and so forth. So a lot of that happened only in the 90s because that's when a lot of the documentation became available.
Great, and I'm glad that more archives and more records are being made available, because that's the kind of our bread and butter, right? Without that, it's kind of hard to reconstruct the past. So, Doug Priest, thanks again for coming on and talking to us about the 1905 revolution. I think we've got our listeners now have a pretty good idea of what happened and have a good starting point if they want to dig further. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Ask Historians podcast, and we'd like to thank Doug Priest once again, that's Doug Priest, aka 10-Minute History on the sub, for taking the time out to talk to us about the 1905 revolution. We also hope that it inspires our listeners to read more about this topic and about Russia in general in the lead up to next month's anniversary of the October Revolution. We'll be back in about 2 weeks with Brian Watson, and I hope to have you with us again then.